Right now, there are 40,000 shipping containers just piled up in the Gulf, completely rotting.
Oh, yeah, it's a massive logistical nightmare.
Right. And meanwhile, interest rates over in the UK are spiking, which is threatening to just totally upend their housing market. And then on the exact opposite side of the world, a prominent women's football team just made this desperate midnight escape from their hotel in Australia.
It sounds like 3 entirely different news broadcasts.
It really does. But what connects these seemingly random, chaotic events? It's over 5,000 military strikes launched across Iran in a matter of days.
Yeah, it is basically the butterfly effect on a geopolitical scale.
Right.
A bomb drops in the Middle East and suddenly a mortgage payment skyrockets in London.
Exactly. So welcome to today's deep dive. You, the listener, reached out to us with a very specific and honestly a really ambitious goal. You want to unpack this massive ongoing geopolitical crisis, which is the U.S. and Israeli military campaign in Iran.
But you didn't just want a simple summary, right?
No, not at all. You asked us to help you practice summarizing complex global events in English. You wanted a sort of masterclass in media literacy using the classic 5 W's framework. Who, what, where, when, and why.
Right, and from an English teaching perspective, you wanted us to dissect the high-level vocabulary the global media uses to report on all this.
Yeah, because you want to understand not just what is happening, but how the English language shapes our perception of it.
Which is such a vital skill. I mean, reading global news is a lot like reading this dense, epic novel. If you don't understand the setting, the mechanics, and if you can't decode the author's specific vocabulary, you might read every single word, but completely miss the plot.
Perfectly said. But before we get into that, we really need to establish the ground rules for this deep dive.
Absolutely.
We are looking at a highly volatile, highly politically charged conflict. It involves multiple nations, militaries, civilian populations. So we are not taking sides here.
Right. We are not endorsing any political viewpoints or military actions from the U.S., Israel, Iran, the U.K., or anyone else.
Not at all. Our strict mission today is just to act as your analytical guides. We're here to help you decode the factual reporting and explain the English terminology used in our stack of sources.
So let's jump right into the narrative of those sources. And we aren't going to just list off the 5 W's like a boring table of contents, right? We need to see how they interlock.
Right, because the sheer scale of the action is where all this reporting really starts. Let's do the when first. The sources note that we're currently on the 11th day of a war that sharply escalated around February 28th.
Yeah, and the what is this massive military campaign that the United States has dubbed Operation Epic Fury. We are talking about over 5,000 coordinated strikes.
5,000. That is just, it's hard to wrap your head around. Fighters, bombers, drones, all of it.
And if we look at the where and the who embedded in that action, the primary forces launching these strikes are the U.S. and Israel. And they're targeting infrastructure deep within Iran. The reporting maps strikes across the capital, Tehran, as well as Bushehr and Khuzestan, so stretching from the west to the south and right into the center of the country.
And we also see the conflict spilling over into Lebanon, right? Where Israel is actively engaged with Hezbollah.
Exactly. But the who isn't just the combatants actively dropping the bombs.
Oh, right, the UK.
Yeah.
The UK is heavily featured in the reporting, but the English used to describe their involvement is super specific.
Very deliberate language.
Yeah. The UK government keeps insisting its posture is purely defensive and evacuation-focused. They've deployed a warship, the HMS Dragon, to Cyprus and put another vessel on standby in Gibraltar.
It's a fascinating contrast in the reporting, really. You have the U.S. launching, epic fury, while the UK is strategically using language to distance itself from the offensive. They're focusing entirely on just pulling your citizens out.
Right, and that deliberate distancing kind of brings us to the most complex piece of the 5 W's puzzle, which is the why. Why unleash 5,000 strikes?
Well, the sources outline 4 stated military goals for the U.S. and Israel. First, destroy Iran's ballistic missile stockpiles. Second, decimate the Iranian Navy.
Okay, those are 2 big ones.
Third, permanently deny Iran the ability to obtain nuclear weapons. And fourth, stop Iranian-backed proxies from destabilizing the region.
Okay, so those are the tactical military goals.
Mm-hmm.
But reading through the analysis, there's this massive void hovering over this entire campaign. Let me throw an analogy at you.
Sure, go for it.
The current U.S. military strategy feels exactly like a chess game, where a player is just aggressively sweeping pieces off the board. They're knocking out the rooks, the knights, the bishops with these 5,000 strikes. but nobody seems to actually know what checkmate looks like.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right, like the military is dismantling all of this infrastructure, but what is the ultimate political objective?
And that disconnect, that gap between military action and political resolution is the central anxiety of all the international analysts we reviewed.
Yeah, they're all worried about it.
The United States has unleashed this overwhelming display of power, but they haven't articulated a precise political endgame. In fact, the reporting highlights that President Donald Trump has publicly mused about several entirely contradictory goals.
Like what?
Well, at various points, he's floated the idea of regime change, then he suggested unconditional surrender, then he mentioned installing a compliant government, or even, sparking a popular uprising.
You can't program a military to achieve all of those wildly different endgames simultaneously. It just doesn't work.
Precisely. And the historical consensus from the analysts is really clear here. Wars that begin without a hyper-specific political objective are the hardest ones to end.
Because you don't know where the finish line is.
Right. If you don't define the finish line before you start running, you never stop. You can bomb every military installation in the country, but without a defined political mechanism to translate that destruction into peace, the conflict just metastasizes.
Okay, so now that we have the 5 Ws locked in, and we understand that big strategic void at the center of this, let's pivot to the English language lesson. You wanted a masterclass in the vocabulary of global news, so let's analyze the specific rhetoric used here.
Yes, let's look at the words they're choosing.
For example, the BBC correspondent, Jeremy Bowen, describes the U.S. campaign as a terrifying onslaught.
Let's break that down from an English teaching perspective. Why does a veteran correspondent choose the word onslaught rather than simply saying attack or bombardment?
Right, it feels heavier.
It does. An onslaught implies a force of nature. It carries the connotation of a fierce, destructive, and overwhelmingly disproportionate assault. By using onslaught, the media subtly strips away the idea of a fair, two-sided fight. You don't defeat an onslaught, you merely try to survive it.
Oh, wow. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And the sources kind of amplify that by calling it the most intense onslaught. They don't just use intense to mean strong. They use it to describe extreme concentration.
It paints a picture of absolute suffocating military power.
Exactly. And alongside that, we see the strikes described as relentless and a barrage. Let's define those.
Well, the connotation of relentless is crucial. A normal strike is an isolated event, but relentless means incessant, oppressive, operating without any pause or mercy at all.
It just doesn't stop.
Right. And you combine that with barrage, which refers to a heavy, concentrated artillery bombardment over a wide area. So the language paints this vivid picture of continuous, widespread destruction designed to break the psychological will, not just the physical buildings.
And the specific physical things they are targeting are Iran's missile stockpiles. Notice how the media doesn't just say they're blowing up weapons.
Right. A stockpile is a large, deliberately accumulated reserve. It implies hoarding for some future purpose.
Yeah, so by repeatedly using the word stockpile, the rhetoric subtly justifies the preemptive nature of the strikes. The stated goal is to diminish this capacity, which means to fundamentally weaken and reduce Iran's ability to wage war.
But here is where the rhetoric collides with reality, and the vocabulary gets truly fascinating.
How so?
Well, the U.S. military action is described with all these words denoting an unstoppable destructive force, right? Onslaught, barrage, relentless. Yet the sources describe the Iranian regime using one very specific word, which is resilient.
Oh, I noticed that too. The media basically portrays an unstoppable force hitting an immovable object. To be resilient means to be able to withstand or recover quickly from difficult conditions. So is the media praising the regime with that word, or just explaining a tactical miscalculation by the U.S.?
Definitely the latter. The word resilient here acts as an analytical critique of the U.S. strategy.
Oh.
The reports indicate that the Iranian command structure is absorbing the onslaught much better than Washington anticipated. So the English language itself reveals the strategic frustration. You can diminish a stockpile with a relentless barrage, but if the underlying regime remains resilient, your military victory doesn't translate into a political one.
That is such an incredible way to read the news. You aren't just absorbing the facts. You are reading the subtext of the vocabulary.
Exactly.
But, military strikes don't just obliterate physical infrastructure. They immediately detonate across global supply chains. So let's shift our focus to the business English used in these sources, because the language changes dramatically when we start talking about the economy.
Yeah, The fulcrum of this entire economic anxiety is the Strait of Hormuz. The sources refer to it repeatedly as a key shipping lane.
Key shipping lane.
Right. In business English, a key shipping lane is this sterile, almost bureaucratic term for a primary route of international trade. But in this specific context, that sterile term masks a terrifying reality. The strait handles roughly 20% of the world's exported oil supply.
20%. It's the ultimate global choke point.
It really is.
And the tension around that choke point creates this bizarre rhetorical tightrope for politicians.
Yeah.
The sources highlight how President Trump is attempting to reassure the global markets.
Let's define reassure in this context.
Yeah. In financial reporting, to reassure means to actively restore confidence, right?
Yeah.
To signal to investors that volatility will be contained. He is trying to broadcast stability, insisting this won't be a long war.
But simultaneously, he is using social media to threaten Iran, stating that if they mine that key shipping lane, they will face military consequences at a level never seen before.
Wait, I have to challenge the logic of this entire strategy. Isn't trying to reassure the global markets while simultaneously dropping 5,000 bombs in the world's most critical energy hub? Isn't that essentially like trying to put out a house fire while actively selling tickets to view the flames?
That is a brilliant analogy.
It's just a profound, almost absurd contradiction. You can't bomb a region into stability and expect commodity traders to just relax.
And your reaction is exactly what the data is reflecting. The markets aren't buying the reassurance at all. When we look at the vocabulary of financial reporting in the texts, we see oil prices experiencing a spike or a jump.
Those aren't gentle words?
No, these aren't just words for going up. They denote sudden, sharp, panic-driven upward movements. And even when prices do come down after a reassuring political statement, the sources note they move down sharply.
Sharply.
Right. The adverb sharply indicates a steep, rapid decline. The language reflects a deeply jittery, volatile financial world that just doesn't trust the political rhetoric.
And that volatility isn't just a theoretical problem for Wall Street traders. The sources map out this massive ripple effect hitting everyday people, particularly in the UK.
Oh, the economic pain is very real.
It translates into terms like price gouging. The UK Chancellor is accusing petrol stations of taking advantage of the crisis to artificially inflate fuel prices up to 180 pence per litre.
Let's make sure we define that phrase. Price gouging is the exploitation of a crisis for excessive profit. It's an important business term.
Definitely. But the structural damage goes deeper than the gas pump. Official forecasters are warning that the resulting supply chain shock could push UK inflation to 3%.
Which is huge.
Right. That sudden inflationary pressure throws future central bank interest rate cuts out the window. And that has already pushed a typical 2-year mortgage deal up to 4.93%.
Which brings us back to those shipping containers you mentioned at the very beginning of the deep dive.
Yes. 40,000 containers a week are piling up in the Gulf because commercial vessels are simply too afraid to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. For listeners looking to understand supply chain mechanics, this is a disaster.
Absolute disaster.
If those containers hold perishable goods, agricultural exports, or time-sensitive electronics, the delay doesn't just defer the cost. It destroys the value of the goods entirely. The ripple effect is absolute.
And this economic reality fundamentally alters the political reality, which is probably the most crucial analytical takeaway from our sources today.
Yes.
Well, because this economic pain, the inflation, the mortgage spikes, the price gouging, it's hitting American and Western voters right now. So the politics of sustaining this war are deteriorating quickly. This brings us to a phrase the analysts use that perfectly encapsulates modern warfare. The administration is desperately trying to shape a victory narrative.
A victory narrative. Let's pull that apart. What does that actually mean?
When a government lacks that precise political objective we discussed earlier, and the economic bleeding becomes a liability at the ballot box, leaders need to invent a story. They need to construct a victory narrative that allows them to declare the mission a success and withdraw, regardless of whether the situation on the ground has actually been resolved. They use language to define what winning looks like retroactively.
Oh, wow. So they base it on what the public will accept rather than what the military actually achieved.
Exactly.
That is the ultimate aha moment for me. The vocabulary of the war, like how the government defines success or failure, is actually being dictated by the price of gas back home. If the economic pain gets too high, the rhetoric pivots to declare victory so they can stop the bleeding.
It is the stark reality of how domestic economics constrain foreign policy.
Okay, so we've covered the macroeconomics and the high-level political spin. But to really understand a geopolitical crisis, we have to look at the ground level.
We do.
We need to examine the human toll and the specific language used to report on civilian displacement and resistance, because the numbers in these sources are just devastating.
The human cost is immense. A U.S. human rights group cited in the reporting states that over 11,245 people have died since the conflict began, and that includes at least 194 children. The UN estimates that around 100,000 people have been rendered homeless.
It's horrific.
Yeah.
And when the media describes the movement of these displaced populations, they use a very specific phrase. They say, a steady stream of Iranians fleeing toward the Turkish border.
A steady stream. It's a phrase that evokes the dynamics of fluid, right? Unbroken, continuous, and driven entirely by gravity and necessity.
Yeah.
It is a powerful descriptive tool, but rhetorically it can also have a dehumanizing effect. It kind of reduces thousands of individual human tragedies into a singular flowing mass.
Exactly. And you contrast that flowing movement with the word used for foreign nationals in the region, which is stranded.
Right.
To be stranded means to be left without the means to move, trapped by external circumstances. The sources note there are 173,000 British nationals registered in the region. While 45,000 have managed to evacuate, hundreds of thousands of foreigners remain stranded.
So the media uses the language of forced motion, a steady stream for the refugees, and the language of paralysis stranded for the expats.
It really highlights the different layers of vulnerability in a war zone, doesn't it?
It certainly does.
But, amid all the massive data points, the 5,000 strikes, the 40,000 containers, the 100,000 homeless movie, there's one specific narrative in the sources that absolutely gripped me. It's the story of the Iranian women's football team.
Yes, the national team competing at the Asian Cup in Australia. It is basically a microcosm of the entire geopolitical struggle, just played out by a handful of athletes.
Let's use our analytical lens to decode what happened here.
Yes.
So, days before the bombing officially started, the team was on the pitch in Australia. And before their match, the players made a collective decision to stay completely silent during the Iranian national anthem.
And for that silent protest, the sources note they were immediately accused of being traitors by regime loyalists back home.
Traitors.
The word traitor, someone who betrays their country, is perhaps the most dangerous label an authoritarian government can place on a citizen. It instantly strips away your legal protections and makes you a target.
Because of that label, the situation escalated from a sporting event to an international rescue operation. The night before the team was scheduled to fly back to Iran, 5 players managed to slip out of their hotel, escaping their minders.
Let's explain that word. In the rhetoric of authoritarian regimes, a minder is a government-appointed official tasked with surveilling and controlling the movements of citizens when they travel abroad.
So they aren't coaches.
No, they're wardens.
Right. So the players vanished, and the Australian government reacted with what the sources describe as lightning speed. Let's define that one too.
Lightning speed. It means moving so exceptionally fast that you cut through all the usual bureaucratic red tape, recognizing that the threat to life is immediate. They were granted humanitarian visas instantly.
But the tragedy embedded in this reporting is the contrast with those who didn't escape.
Yes. The news broadcasts showed footage of the remaining players, including their prominent 34-year-old team captain, boarding a bus to the airport to return to Iran. The journalistic phrase used to describe this visual is under duress.
That is such a critical phrase for media literacy. What does duress look like on a news broadcast?
Under duress means performing an action because you are being heavily pressured, threatened, or forced. You are entirely stripped of free will.
Right.
In the footage, duress doesn't necessarily look like a gun to the head. It looks like players being subtly but undeniably corralled, physically guided, and monitored by state officials onto a bus. The broadcast uses the phrase to legally and morally clarify that these women are not returning voluntarily.
I look at this football team's story, and it is the perfect metaphor for this entire deep dive. You have this seemingly small, quiet action on a sports field, just keeping your mouth shut during a song. But within the context of the massive 5Ws geopolitical crisis we outlined today, that silence carries life or death stakes. It requires a dramatic escape from government minders.
It is the ultimate expression of the final vocabulary word we need to highlight today: Defiance.
Defiance.
Defiance isn't just disagreement, it is open resistance. It is bold, deliberate disobedience against an overwhelming authority. We see defiance on the macro scale in the reporting, with the resilient Iranian regime absorbing the onslaught. But we see its purest form on the micro scale, on a football pitch in Australia, where a few athletes display profound defiance at the cost of everything they ever known.
We have covered immense ground today. We took on your challenge to map this epic novel of a conflict. We built out the 5 Ws, the U.S. and Israel executing a massive 11-day campaign called Operation Epic Fury across Iran, while the UK maintains a defensive posture.
We explored the strategic void of launching an onslaught without a clear political objective.
Exactly. We analyzed the rhetoric of war, how an unstoppable barrage meets a resilient regime. We traced the economic shockwaves from the key shipping lane of the Strait of Hormuz directly to mortgage spikes and price gouging in the UK.
And finally, we decoded the human language of the crisis. We contrasted the steady stream of refugees with the stranded expats, culminating in the lightning-speed defiance of a football team.
You asked for a masterclass to help you practice summarizing complex global events in English, and I believe you have the rhetorical tools to do that now.
I think so, too. So, here is our call to action for you, the listener. Take the vocabulary words we unpacked today. Words like onslaught, reassure, price gouging, duress, and defiance. Apply the 5 Ws framework to a local news story in your own country.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Practice using these concepts to decode how your local media shapes the narrative. Notice when they use a word that implies a force of nature versus a word that implies a calculated choice.
I love that exercise. It really turns reading the news from a passive chore into an active investigation. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, building directly on the concept of the victory narrative we discussed.
Sure.
The sources make it clear that the economic realities, the price of oil, inflation at the supermarket, the cost of housing, are putting immense pressure on politicians to invent a story of success so they can end the war and save their poll numbers.
The domestic economy ultimately dictates the foreign policy endgame.
Exactly. So here is the question. If modern warfare is dictated just as much by the price of a gallon of gas and domestic election polling as it is by the destruction of actual military targets, what does winning a war actually mean in the 21st century?
That's a huge question.
Does victory now depend entirely on the government's ability to craft a good public relations narrative, rather than achieving actual lasting peace on the ground? The next time you see a politician standing at a podium declaring that a mission has been accomplished, ask yourself, who is actually writing the end of this story, the generals or the spin doctors?
Something to really think about.
Definitely. Until next time, keep reading between the lines and we'll see you on the next deep dive.
喜欢这种学习方式，欢迎订阅我的频道，让我们一起用下一个10分钟把商业英文变简单。